All right, so First Nephi chapter 6 through 10. This is travels, teachings, and revelations in the wilderness. I think you're going to like what we have this week for our content. There's a lot to cover here, so I'm going to try to move as quickly as we can. But there's some really good stuff, so I think you're going to enjoy it today. Okay, so just kind of want to give it a quick overview as far as the location goes. So First Nephi 6 through 10, we have 6 through 7. 7 and then 8 through 10, right? So obviously they started out in Jerusalem. Then they started, in First Nephi 1 through 5, kind of moving out of Jerusalem towards the borders of the Red Sea, which scholars suspect to be probably here. Well, that's probably accurate. That's the earliest place where the Red Sea would be. And then also there's all this wilderness in between. And also what they suspect would be the Valley of Lemuel, which would be over here, right? So you can see here, First Nephi 6 and 7 is just kind of the wilderness. And it could be the borders, probably somewhere anywhere between the borders of the Red Sea and Jerusalem. That's where this First Nephi 6 and 7 take place. First Nephi 7 happens within Jerusalem itself because Nephi and his brothers go to Jerusalem to persuade Ishmael's family to join them in the wilderness, get some wives. And First Nephi 8 through 10, this is in the Valley of Lemuel, right? So which is, scholars suspect to be around here. This place called Wadi Taib al-Isim. Now, we don't know for sure this is where it is, but this is the most likely location because this is matches the description from the Book of Mormon. It's near the Red Sea. There's this Valley of Lemuel here, or a river of Laman here in the Valley of Lemuel. And there's all this other thing, which is just another evidence that Joseph Smith was under inspiration because he wouldn't have known about these locations, okay? He didn't have the maps and stuff like that. So this is pretty cool. So we have that. Now we're just going to kind of go into the chapter summaries and some of the insights we have from there. Now, I'm going to skip over chapter 8 and then come back to chapter 8 in the end because that is a very rich, deep chapter. And I kind of want to go over the high-level overview first, okay? So chapter 6, 7, I'll skip 8, and then we'll do 9 and 10, and we'll come back to 8, okay? So chapter 6, this is Nephi explains the intent of the small plates. So it's a pretty short chapter. He just talks about his intent to focus on the spiritual teachings over detailed history. He says the detailed history is written on the record of his father, which would be known as the Book of Lehi, or this would be referring to the lost 116 pages, or 300 pages if you follow Don Bradley's work. 116 pages that Martin Harris lost when showing to his wife. Okay. So that's the Book of Lehi, and that's the large plates. So he says the detailed history is there. He's not going to cover it here. He says the intent is to bring people to God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is Yahweh or Jehovah. And then he commands the seed to only, fill these plates with the records of, things of great worth. So small plates represent First Nephi through Omni. Okay, First Nephi, Second Nephi, Jacob, Enos, Jeremiah. Okay, chapter 7. This is, and then actually take note. There is also another chapter. Chapter 9 very much mirrors this, and I'm going to talk about that here in a second. Okay, chapter 7. I'm going to call it Wife and Strife. So this is where they journey back to Jerusalem for Ishmael and his family, and there's some family strife. They rebel against Nephi, and then Nephi is delivered by faith. Okay, so First Nephi, the first 5 verses, Nephi and his brothers go to Jerusalem to try to persuade Ishmael to join them in the wilderness. Now, you notice that Lemuel, whined and complained the whole time about going back before, because it probably took them several weeks. About 2 weeks journey is what scholars estimate each way. 2 weeks there, 2 weeks back. So it takes like a month journey just to get there and back, right? So they complained before, rightfully so, about going back to get the plates. But as soon as they mention wives, you don't hear them complaining. Go figure, right? So that's funny. Now, he knew he's a scholar, he suggests that Ishmael and Lehi were probably related, either cousins or brothers. I think he said something that it was customary for daughters or for their sons to marry their paternal uncle's daughters or something like that. So Nephi, and I think, if I understand that correctly, Nephi could have been marrying his cousins. I don't know. That's something like that. Or maybe cousins, second cousins or something. But there's no hard facts for this. This is just speculation based off of other historical insights. Okay. So verse 6 through 15, there's some rebellion and preaching. Lemuel and some of the other Ishmael's family, they get tired of, traveling, and so they want to fight back. They go back to Jerusalem, and so they rebel against them. Nephi preached to them. He keeps saying, "How have you forgotten?" He reminds them of the promises of the desirable promised land. and the dangers of returning to Jerusalem, because he says it's prophesied it's going to go into destruction. He mentions Jeremiah being cast into prison, which is mentioned here in Jeremiah 37. You can read that here, where he's cast into prison. Jeremiah is contemporary with Lehi and Nephi's family, Jeremiah in the Bible, in the Old Testament. Okay, so verse 16 through 21 is the reaction to Nephi's preaching. They get mad at him for his preaching because, let's face it, we love Nephi, but he's kind of preachy sometimes, right? So they bind him, they pray, Nephi prays for help, and he's released miraculously. Now, something to point out here, it's interesting, is that he, let's see here, in 16 through 21, you can see that he prays, they bind him, let's see here, and he prays for strength to burst the bands, right? But then after, he didn't burst his bands, the bands were loose. So interesting insight here. Just kind of shows that Nephi, one, isn't expecting God to do everything for him. He's trying to burst the bands himself, and he can't. And so he asks God to give him extra strength, right? He's not asking God just to, do it for him. But God actually answers in a different way than is expected, and he loosened the bands for him. So insight here is that sometimes when you pray for things, the Lord answers, but in a different way than we expect, okay? This also gives opportunity for daughters of Ishmael to get involved and soften the hearts of Nephi to soften the hearts of Laman and Lemuel, and for Nephi the opportunity to forgive. Okay, so verses 21 and 22, they continue traveling, and that now they have Ishmael's family and travel to the valley of Lemuel, which is where I showed you before, right here. Okay. Chapter 8, we're going to come back to that because there's a lot to cover there, and then we'll come back to chapter 9 real quick. So this is where Nephi talks about the two plates. It very closely resembles chapter 6. I'll talk about that in a second. He talks about the large plates and the small plates. He covers the history of his people. The large plates covers the history of his people. He keeps referring to the large plates as the other plates, and he keeps referring to the small plates as these plates, because this is what we're reading right now. These are the small plates. He says the small plates focus on the spiritual matters. The large plates cover the history of the king's wars and contentions. And he says he doesn't know the purpose of making the small plates, but that the Lord knows. We now know why. It's because the Book of Lehi was going to be lost by Martin Harris, as mentioned before, and so this is kind of a backup record. Okay, and something to keep in mind here is that this could possibly be a way of separating out ideas, because in the ancients they didn't have chapter headings, stuff like that, so they had different literary techniques to demonstrate when a new idea had stopped. And so I think he starts in chapter 6. There's some there. They have a thought through chapter 7 and 8, and then chapter 9 is kind of reiterating what was said in chapter 6 to say, hey, this is a separate thought. Okay. Now, chapter 10, we have Lehi's messianic prophecies and Nephi's desire. Okay. So we have Lehi's prophecies, verses 1 through 16. So verse 3 talks about the Babylonian exile and return to Judah. Like I've mentioned in other videos, this is an extremely important historical event in biblical history. There's a lot of things that sprung out of this Babylonian exile. But basically, as I mentioned before, what happened is King Zedekiah rebels against the Babylonian rule, and fights against the Babylonians, which is under King Nebuchadnezzar. And basically, the Babylonians defeat the kingdom of Judah, destroy the temple, which is Solomon's temple, and they send the Jews captive into Babylon. Okay, so they're in Judah, send them to Babylon. Okay, then about 40 years later, roughly speaking, Cyrus the Great from Persia conquers the Babylonians and issues a decree to allow the exiled Jews to return back to Judah and rebuild the temple. So this is prophecy, fulfilling the prophecy of Lehi, and also Isaiah talks about this as well. So Isaiah talks about, basically what this exact thing, Babylonian exile, return to Judah. Okay. Then Lehi talks about 600 years later, there'd be the coming of the Messiah. You'll notice he in First Nephi always uses the term Messiah or Lord God or something like that, right? It doesn't actually ever use the term Christ until 2 Nephi chapter 10 verse 3. So just fun little factoid there. Then he talks about his baptism in Bethlehem. John the Baptist is the forerunner. Okay, and then later he talks about the scattering and gathering of Israel. He talks about the olive tree in verse 12, which is preparatory for which we'll get into a lot more depth in Jacob 5. Which I don't understand yet, but maybe I will by the time I do a video on it. Verse 13 talks about going to the land of promise, and it's part of the scattering. So he talks about how, let's see here. Give me 1 second here. Verse 13, he talks about how, We're led with one accord to the land of promise and the fulfilling of the word of the Lord, that we should be scattered upon all the face of the earth. Okay. So they're reading Isaiah essentially, and if I understand correctly, and Isaiah talks about the scattering of Israel and whatnot, and so they're interpreting themselves as saying, "Hey, we're part of that scattering, and this is, part of that is going to the promised land." Some scholars, BRU scholar, I believe, was saying that they probably reinterpreted Isaiah. The original intent of Isaiah probably wasn't talking about this exactly, but they reinterpreted Isaiah to make it meaningful for them. Okay. Now. Something to point out, though, is that this very much ties into the title page of the Book of Mormon, where it talks about how, they're remnant of the house of Israel, the Lamanites, right? And, to remind them that what the Lord's great done, for their fathers, they know the covenants of the Lord, they're not cast out forever, right? So this very much ties in. They're saying, hey, this book is for you guys, right? That's the title page of the Book of Mormon. And this relates to the scattering gathering of Israel, basically saying, hey, you guys are you Lamanites, American Indians, are part of, the lost tribes of Israel. And so we're trying to gather you back again, right? That's kind of the purpose of the Book of Mormon. So that ties in very nicely. Verse 17 through 22, we have Nephi's desire, where he desires to see, hear, and know the things that his father described. He says, God same yesterday, today, and forever, which cross-references with Hebrews 13, and that he who seeks will find, cross-references here. Mysteries of God will be unfolded by the power of the Holy Ghost. This is the first time we hear the term days of probation, implying that this with days of probation means, this life is a testing ground for our progression. This idea, to my knowledge, isn't fleshed out in the Bible at all, right? So first time this term's used, and then later this is clarified in depth in 2 Nephi chapter 2, okay? So that's all the other chapters. Now we're going to go in depth into chapter 8. This is where there's a lot of stuff to cover here. So first off, this is kind of the outline I'm going to go over for chapter 8. We have the Jungian archetypes, Joseph Smith Sr.'s dream, chapter summary, different groups and insights, okay? So Carl Jung is a very famous analytical psychologist. He, he's someone who should take credit for a lot of things in the world of psychology, had a lot of great theories. One of them being about archetypes in the collective unconscious. Now, I'm not an expert in this, but he observed different symbols, themes, myths, in different myths and religions, and dreams across cultures, and he found common threads and similarities between all of them. So he was exposed to mythology and religion. He had psychological practice where he saw people's and heard people's dreams and fantasies, and found how remarkably similar they were to these mythological contexts, right? And then he developed these archetypes and proposed that these, which are different symbols, and proposed that these universal symbols arise from what he calls our collective unconscious, basically something that's deep inside our psyche, inside of our biology, or some people will call it spiritual memory, that we all share, and it kind of bubbles up into our conscious mind from time to time. Okay, and then he applied it and expanded it. Now, some examples of these different archetypes, there's a lot of them, but some of the religious archetypes are that you'll see across different cultures is virgin birth, the idea of a Messiah figure, right? The idea of a flood or global flood that's prevalent across all the world, apocalypse, and tree of life. These are just some of them. I could list a lot more, but this is a good start. And so tree of life is something you'll find forever, and just a personal, all over the globe. And personal philosophy of mine is when you find an idea or principle held to be true across a wide range of religions, cultures, and time periods, you might want to pay attention, okay? Because there's probably some truth there. So the tree of life is found in all these different cultures. What he found that a common thread is it symbolizes interconnectedness of life, growth, regeneration, unification of the earth, roots of the sky, right? So like the earth goes into the roots go into the underworld, and then the branches and leaves go into the sky, which is kind of a symbol for heaven, okay? And then often represents the idea of a central axis mundi, connecting the heavens, earth, and the underworld. Okay, that's kind of what I mentioned a second ago. And then it's also not a symbol of life, but it's also immortality, knowledge, and wisdom. So you'll see how this reflects in Lehi's dream, in the tree of life, in the Garden of Eden, so whatnot. Okay, so here's some examples of the tree of life. This is in Norse mythology, Judeo-Christian. We're very familiar with the Garden of Eden, right? Hinduism, the banyan tree, ancient Egypt, Chinese mythology, and Mesoamerican cultures. These all have different tree of life stories to them. Okay. Now, that being said, what's interesting is, like I said, Jung would find these different dreams of people, that match these different archetypes, right? So we will find that Joseph Smith Sr. actually had a very similar dream to Lehi. And you can look through all these different links. Basically, if you look at this, you'll see that Joseph Smith Sr. and Lehi's dream match are very, very similar. You can see these, similarities here. Large and spacious field. This is desolate field. Saw a man, guy came to him, straight narrow path, river of water. So this is Joseph Smith's dream. This is Lehi's dream. You can see fruit, desirable. You can go through all this, but basically, there's a lot of similarities between the Lehi's tree of life and Joseph Smith Sr.'s tree of life. So this would have happened. Joseph Smith Sr. had 7 visions. This is one of them, or dreams. This would have happened in 1811, and then the Book of Mormon happened in 1830. Now, you might think, okay, well, maybe Joseph Smith just plagiarized this and put it in historical version, right? And sure, if you're skeptic, that maybe that's what you believe. But however, I will say that this account was written by Lucy Smith after Joseph Smith Sr.'s death, and it actually wasn't even written by her; it was written by some other scribe, right? But Lucy was retelling it in 1845, 34 years later, 15 years after the Book of Mormon had been published. So it's very possible. Secondhand account and not even written by her, 30 years out of the fact. So it's very possible that, maybe it is accurate, but, and they had the same dream, but it's also possible that, maybe she just didn't have, she was confusing the Book of Mormon with this. So we'll talk about that here. So 3 different conclusions: fabrication, Lucy's, recollections, basically what I just said here: fabrication, similar visions, or the Book of Mormon, instead of it's the other way around. Basically, the Book of Mormon influenced Lucy's version. She read the Book of Mormon, and it influenced her retelling of Joseph Sr.'s dream. Now, we can all decide what that dream is, what your conclusion is, but those are kind of the options, okay? So we talked about Jung, we talked about Joseph Sr.'s dream. Now we're going to go through a summary real quick. You can read that real quick. 1 through 8, all here. You can see, I'm not going to go through all this, but I want to talk about the different groups within the dream. So there are essentially five different groups, if I've counted them correctly. If you want to correct me, let me know. But there are those who partake of the fruit and they're happy. There are those in the large and spacious building. There are those who are shamed. They partake of the fruit and they're ashamed. There are those who are drowned in the river, and there are those who start on the path, but they get lost in the midst of darkness, and they don't reach the tree. Okay, there's the verses listed here. You can kind of read basically the different different details here if you'd like, but some of the insights here are basically that the people who, you'll notice that the people who are ashamed, who partake of the fruit, but then they act as if they're ashamed, those are the people that actually cling to the rod. So I don't know if I can find that right here. Let's see, 1 Nephi chapter 8, verse 25. So you can see here, they were clinging to the rod, and then they went and they were ashamed. Okay. Now, on contrast, the other people, there are others who pressed their way forward, continued holding fast to the rod of iron, and they came forth and fell down and partook of the fruit of the tree. Okay, so what are some insights we can hear from here? So the people who were clinging, they're the ones that were ashamed, and the people who hold fast, those are the ones that were happy, and those are also the ones that bowed down before the tree. Now, what you can, a lesson you can take from this, this is at least how I interpret it, is that the people who cling are kind of stuck on the letter of the law. They don't actually let the Spirit come in and change their hearts. And so when they partake of the fruit, it's not very sweet because, their heart, their being, they haven't become something different. They just did something different and followed the letter, right? Versus the people who held fast, they focused on the tree and kept their eye on the vision of the tree instead of focusing on the nitty gritty of the iron rod. Those were those who, they allowed their hearts to be changed so that the fruit became delicious for them. That's how I interpret it, at least. Okay? Also, these are the people who, they come and bow down before the tree, meaning like they just recognize the significance of it, versus these people just are kind of more casual about it. So interesting little insight there. Another quick insight is that you'll notice that this says the fruit. was desirable to make one happy. And then it talks about happy. And then once they actually partook the fruit, it filled his soul with exceedingly great joy. And then immediately after, he became desirous that his family should partake of it also. So it's interesting. He knows it's going to make him happy, but then he doesn't experience exceedingly great joy, which is kind of a new level, until he actually partakes of it. And then once he does, then he wants to share with everybody else. And this is a very human thing. Whenever you experience something, amazing, or you taste something really good, you have good pizza, then you want everyone else to taste it. That's a very human thing. So that is my insight for this week. There's a lot you can take away from here, but hopefully that is helpful. If you have any questions, comments, anything that you learned, let me know in the comments, and we'll go from there. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye-bye.